In 1757, the British East India Company defeated the Nawab Sirajuddaula in the Battle of Plassey and occupied Bengal. This resulted in strengthening of the company's influence over the next 100 years in entire India. The annexation policies, oppressive colonial rule of the British rulers, caused dissatisfaction among the people of India. So many revolts and armed rebellions broke out all over the subcontinent for the freedom of the nation. In the process of movements and uprisings, there were many tribals who had contributed enormously for India's freedom, while a good number of tribal leaders sacrificed their lives at the hands of British rulers. In Odisha, many tribal movements and uprisings had taken place during the British regime against the rulers for granting the independence.
The Kandhas of Odisha were the first tribe who raised their arms against the British in the Paika Rebellion of 1817. But it was the second Kandha Rebellion in 1835 which brought to the forefront the first tribal freedom fighter of Odisha in the form of Dora Bisoi.
Annexation of Ghumsar Zamindari, removal of the local feudal aristocracy from power and position, activities of Christian missionaries, arbitrary incursion into some of their age-old customs like Miriya or human sacrifice, female infanticide, and exploitation of intermediaries and moneylenders provoked the Kandhas to rise in revolt against the British government.
Dora Bisoi was a Beniya Kandha born in Benjigiri village located near Kulada of the lower Ghumsar area. Raja Dhananjay Bhanja conferred on him the title of Veeravara Patra and appointed him as the Malaya Bisoi or the head agent to represent the Malaya Kandhas of his estate. The Raja also appointed him as a commander-in-chief of the Ghumsar army, conferring on him the title of Bahadur Bakshi.
Under his leadership, the Kandhas became violent and attacked a British detachment between Ghumsar Udaygiri and Durga Prasad village. In that encounter, 13 soldiers and 2 European officers, Lieutenant Bromley and Ensign Gibbon, were killed.
In order to capture Dora Bisoi and his supporters, a vigorous military operation was undertaken by the British, and most of them were either shot dead or hung from the trees. Martial law was imposed, but the rebellion could not be extinguished. Dora Bisoi escaped from Ghumsar and took shelter in Angul.
The rebellion was suppressed for a while, but the authorities could not apprehend Dora Bisoi, in spite of having announced a reward of 5,000 rupees for his capture. At the instigation of Henry Ricketts, the Commissioner of Odisha, Raja Somnath Singh Jagadev of Angul handed over Dora Bisoi to the British forces in 1837, when Dora visited him to seek military assistance. He was arrested and sent to a prison in Ooty near Madras. There, he died in 1846 as a state prisoner, leaving behind a glorious legacy of brave and resolute struggle against the British.
After the arrest of his uncle Dora Bisoi, Chakra Bisoi began to nourish a desire to revive the Kandha resistance against the British rule. He knew that the rebellious spirit of the Kandhas had not died in spite of the suppression of earlier revolts. He could also see the development of fresh complications in the wake of the suppression of Miriya by the British and the appointment of Captain S.C. Macpherson as the Miriya agent. The excesses committed by Macpherson in punishing the culprits of Miriya created a strong resentment among the Kandhas. Chakra Bisoi took advantage of the situation. He posed himself as the champion of Meria, and the Kandhars rallied around him. Captain McPherson captured and liberated 117 Meria victims within a week in February 1846. It was provocation enough for the Kandhars to revolt. Chakra Bisoi came to the forefront and organized secret councils. Under his leadership, the rebellious Kandhars assembled before McPherson's camp in Bisipara on the 14th of March 1846 and demanded the release of the victims. McPherson had to yield to their demand. He could do nothing to counteract them. So, he had to return to his headquarters in the wake of the rainy season. After the rains, McPherson returned with his troops in November 1846 and burned down some Kandha village in Baudh area.
This humiliation inspired Chakra Bisoi to organize the Kandhas living around Baudh, Dasphala, Kandhamal, Ghumsar and adjoining areas. A massive Kandha revolt erupted in Ghumsar area towards the end of 1846 under his leadership. He was supported by the Chakapada Paikas and Bisois, the Kandhas of the western Muthas, including the Kandhas of Baudh and the Paikas of Ghumsar. The British brought in General Dice to successfully quell the rebellion. But Chakra Bisoi could not be captured.
Campbell, who succeeded McPherson in April 1847, followed by and large a conciliatory policy towards the Kandhars and prevailed in his attempts to rescue many Meria victims tactfully. However, he could not bring Chakra Bisoi to surrender. The British authorities believed that the Raja of Angul, Somnath Singh, extended secret help to Chakra Bisoi and Nabagana Kahara of Ratabira, who had led the Kandha uprising in the Baudh region. Raja Somnath Singh was deposed in 1848 and Angul was brought under the direct administration of the British government.
Adopting guerrilla warfare, Chakra Bisoi went on harassing the British from time to time, which worried the then Governor-General Lord Dalhousie. A reward of 3,000 rupees was declared by the government of Bengal for Chakra's capture. Chakra remained underground in the Kandhamalas from 1849 to 1855.
After the British captured Kalahandi, the kings and zamindars of Kalahandi collected tax from the Kandhars, and their age-old tradition of Meria sacrifice was banned. The aggrieved Kandhars rose in revolt under the leadership of Brindo Majhi, who was born at Urladani in a tribal family.
A.C. McNeill, who succeeded John Campbell as the Meria agent, arrested the Borikia Kandha leader Rindo Maji and his son Palaso Maji in 1853 and kept them in jail at Rasalkonda without trial.
In December 1855, during his annual tour of the Kalahandi state, the Meria agent paraded the prisoner Rindo Maji in chains from village to village. The Borikia of Kandhas, who could not stand this humiliation, hurled on their chief by the British agent. On the 10th of December 1855, they attacked the camp of Lieutenant Colonel McNeill. However, the attack was repulsed with some casualties on both sides.
2 or 3 days later, the Kutia Kandhas joined the Borikia Kandhas and they together made the second attack on the agent's camp. It was due to the wisdom and help of Dinabandhu Patnaik, the Tehsildar, that McNeill could escape to Rasalkonda.
Superintendent Samuels believed that Chakra Bisoi was responsible for uniting the two tribes. After this incident, he retreated from Madanpur.
Madanpur, Karunda was completely independent territory. British were not allowed to enter the territory of Madanpur, Rampur. The British Superintendent Samuel requested Raja Hariyar Singh Dev to hand over Chakravis. Chakravis was by that time was taking shelter in Madanpur kingdom.
The Zamindar of Madanpur expressed his ignorance of Chakrabisoi's presence.
Madanpur, Rampur. Chakrabisoi was a great leader. He was fighting for the tribes.
In March 1856, he was reported to be hiding in Athagaon in Patna state under the shelter of Majhi Dharam Singh Mandhata, the Zamindar of Athagaon. To arrest him, Dinabandhu Patnaik marched to Athagaon with a force of 70 soldiers. Chakrabisoi, however, managed to escape. But his principal assistant, Bhudiya Sardar, and many other followers along with their families were captured. Dharam Singh Mandhata languished in prison.
All attempts to arrest Chakrabisoi proved futile. Nothing was heard of the great Kandha leader Chakra after October 1856. Mysteriously, he disappeared into oblivion sometime before the beginning of the Great Revolt of 1857.
The uprising in Mayurbhanj tributary Mahal in 1857 under the Dharua tribal leader Dayanidhi Dharua was another important movement in the history of modern Odisha. The unjust revenue policy of Raja and the oppressive deposition of the Amalas prompted the tribal people to launch a rebellion against the Raja. The administration tried to suppress the revolt and captured some leaders, but they could not quash it completely, which continued till 1866.
The Kyonjar uprising began in 1890 and lasted for 5 years under the leadership of Dharanidhar Naik, a literate young Bhuiya. The immediate cause of the rebellion was the construction of a canal known as Macho Kandana Jora from Baragaon Pahad to Kyonjargarh, which would carry the stream water to the capital. The cutting of stone was done completely by the Beti system, in which the Bhuiyas were required to render inhuman physical labor.
Dharanidhar Naik fought against slavery for the tribal communities. He strongly instigated the Bhuiyas as well as other tribals like Juang, Bathuri, Kolha and Shaunti to rise in revolt against the tyrannical rule of the Raja. He led the tribal people against British oppression and dominance. The Bhuiyas looted the granaries and procured guns and cannons to wage war. The revolt of the Bhuiyas took a violent turn. But at last he was arrested by Downson and imprisoned for 7 years in Cuttack jail. He was released in 1897 and led the life of a sannyasi.
A strong protest also surfaced among the tribes of Malkangiri against the annexation policy and oppressive revenue system of the British. The last queen of Malkangiri, Bangaru Devi, defeated King Ramachandra Deva III of Jaipur with her powerful and extraordinarily large Koya army. She fought bravely against the British but could not be successful and was finally deposed in 1872. She lost her life at the age of 70 in 1885 after prolonged illness of 5 years. There was complete accession of Malkangiri state into the Madras presidency.
At this juncture, Tamadora of Kondapalli village of Padiya block in Malkangiri district, the hero of Champakhari War of 1860 and the Rampa Revolution of 1862 took command of the tribal people of Malkangiri district, especially the Koya tribe, against British maladministration as well as economic exploitation, and demanded justice for his people from the king and the British.
Leading the Koya troops, Tamadora defeated the British police of Malkangiri in 1880 and declared himself as a ruler of Podia and Mottu. In this incident, one inspector and 6 policemen of Podia police station were killed. This incident is known as the Koya Revolution and had a great impact throughout the country. Colonel McWide of Hyderabad contingent marched with 100 men but was repulsed with a severe attack by the Koya army under the leadership of Tamadora. However, the efforts of this brave young man came to an end when he was brutally killed in the Rampa forest near Motu on the 20th of July 1880 by the military police of Hyderabad. And the then Koya army was fragmented in the absence of a dynamic leader.
Gangpur, one of the biggest princely states of Odisha, experienced violent uprising of tribal peasants in the year 1897. The new land revenue system, which was introduced by King Raghunath Shekhar Deo, led to this tribal rebellion under the leadership of Madri Kalo.
Born in 1848, Madri Kalo, a tribal Gauntia or village headman of Korebag village of Sundargarh, Odisha, organized this movement against the king of Gangpur, who was being supported by the British. This movement is known as Gauntia Meli.
The British government deputed a contingent of troops under the command of the Deputy Commissioner of Singhbhum to assist the Gangpur state policy in suppressing this rebellion. But it was difficult to apprehend Madri Kalo and his followers, who continued the depredatory operations from hideouts in remote hills and forests. Hence, the state administration resorted to diplomacy and with the assistance of Gauntia of Kuranga, succeeded in arresting Madri Kalo in 1900. He was sentenced to 10 years of imprisonment, of which he spent 6 years in Sundargarh jail and the rest in Ranchi. He was released in 1910. 4 years after his release, he breathed his last in 1914 in the village Lamboi near Rajgangpur.
The general complaint of the state of Gangpur was mostly related to exorbitant land rent. The tribals appealed against this abnormal increase, but no relief was granted.
This gave rise to popular discontent. The tribals started a no-rent campaign. The movement was strengthened with the inclusion of the Munda Christians of the Lutheran mission, the Oraons, the Hindus, and also had the support of the tribal leaders and pleaders of Ranchi.
The administration took coercive measures for the recovery of arrear rents, and in early 1939, the state almost found it impossible to collect land revenue from the peasants. Nirmal Munda emerged as the leader of the rebels and intensified the agitation.
Consequently, the Queen Regent announced certain very minor concessions which were not acceptable to the people. The no-rent campaign continued. On the 9th of February 1939, the Maharani convened a meeting at Sargipalli to listen to the grievances of the people and to induce them to make payment. Around 4,000 to 5,000 people from 30 villages attended and presented a charter of demands. The popular demands included not only restitution of the land rent and forest rights of 1910 settlement, but also abolition of Chowkidari tax and the monopoly on the hides. Introduction of responsible government was also asked for, in which the people could exercise the right to vote. Total abolition of Bethi, Bheti, Rasad and Magan was demanded.
But the Queen paid no heed to the demands. The tribals continued their agitation under the leadership of Nirmal Munda. Finding the situation difficult, the state administration requisitioned joint police force to apprehend the leaders. Few of them were arrested.
On the 25th of April 1939, two platoons of armed forces, along with the assistant political agent and the SDO, were sent to the village Amko-Simko of Sundargarh district to arrest Nirmal Munda on the grounds of holding seditious meetings and assaulting a village chowkidar. But a crowd of around 500 defiant tribal people armed with lathis, axes and other crude weapons resisted the arrest of their leader. Consequently, scuffles broke out and the police resorted to firing. 39 people fell dead and 50 were wounded.
Nirmal Munda and many of his associates were arrested. He was sentenced to 6 years of imprisonment in Sundargarh and Sambalpur. He was released from jail on 15th August 1947.
Inspired by Gandhiji's call of Quit India movement, hundreds of tribals of undivided Koraput district participated in the freedom struggle. Several rallies were organized in support of Congress during that period. On the 2nd of August 1942, the District Congress Committee met in full session and decided to start a movement on the lines of the civil disobedience movement under the guidance of Mahatma Gandhi. But the government declared the Congress Party as unlawful and arrested all leaders, as a result of which there was a spontaneous outbreak of violence throughout the region.
The tribals of Nabarangpur subdivision gathered on 24th August 1942 to discuss their future course of action. While proceeding, a big crowd was intercepted at Turi River Bridge near Paprahandi. The crowd could not escape the unprovoked lathi charge and indiscriminate firing by the British police, which led to the death of 19 people while several others were injured. Hundreds were arrested and many were washed away by the floodwaters of the river.
Lakshman Naik was deeply influenced by the national movement and the message of the Congress. He managed to mobilize the tribal people for various development works like construction of roads, buildings, bridges, and establishing schools. He asked the villagers not to pay any taxes. He spearheaded the fight against depression, sufferings, and exploitation. He used non-violence as the main weapon against colonial power. The tribal people called him Gandhi of Malkangiri.
The tribal movement created an unprecedented public awakening in Koraput. The message of Quit India movement was circulated among the people. On August 21st, 1942, tribals from different villages moved towards Mathili, led by Lakshman Naik, holding Congress flags, chanting Ram Dhun. They managed to enter the compound of police station and tried to hoist the flag. Lakshman Naik was not allowed to do that, as Magistrate Mujibur Rahman ordered lathi charge on the demonstrators. As the police opened fire, 5 persons died on spot and 17 were injured. The demonstrators killed were Nakula Pujari, Samara Nayak, Narasingha Bhumia, Linga Bhumia, along with a forest guard named G. Ramaya. The injured Lakshman was thrown into the ditch near the compound. It was a blessing in disguise for the police to implicate Lakshman in a murder case of forest guard G. Ramaiah.
The trial continued for 4 months, and on 13th November 1942, the then Sessions Judge V. Ramanathan handed out the death sentence to Lakshman Naik. On 16th November 1942, he was then sent to Berhampur jail for execution.
Advocate Radhacharan Das and famous freedom fighter Umacharan Patnaik of Berhampur went to Patna High Court and gave an appeal. But the appeal was finally rejected.
When his execution date drew near, all the inmates of Berhampur jail offered prayers. His fellow prisoners wept throughout the night of 28 March 1943.
At the break of dawn on March 29, 1943 at 5:30 a.m., Lakshman Naik gallantly marched towards the gallows. He cheerfully proclaimed these last words.
If the sun is true and so is the moon, it is then equally true that Mother India shall be independent.
Ramurthy, the Jamadar of the jail, pulled the lever bringing down the iron plate under his feet. Thus ended his life, and he was buried inside the jail compound. In the early years of British Raj, no other community in India offered such heroic resistance to British rule or faced such tragic consequences as did the numerous tribal communities of Odisha. Simple, hardworking and peace-loving folks who lived mainly off the agricultural land or forests. These communities rebelled fiercely against the land grabbing and economic exploitation that came with colonial rule. Though these revolts were often unsuccessful in uprooting the British, they could prepare the ground for the struggle that ultimately led to